Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. In this video I'm going to be doing something that has been recommended to me for quite a while and always planned on doing, but it's always been kind of a big undertaking to do. But with my recent project of rewatching every Survivor finale for a finale ranking later this year, I decided to kill multiple birds with one stone here. So here we will be ranking every final tribal performance in the history of Survivor. Now this will be split into two videos. This one will be the winning final tribal performances, while the next one will be the losing final tribal performances. And mixing the two lists doesn't lead to that much intrigue, so that's why I felt okay splitting up these videos. Now I'll say that these lists will be ranked solely off of their performances at final tribal. Now in some sense that is kind of tricky to do, as I do feel like certain winners coming into their final tribal, knowing that they had already won, they do have a bit of an advantage in how they perform, as usually the jury is a lot lighter on them, meaning that they can give more quality answers. But I won't be factoring in how the game was played before these performances. I'll solely be basing it on the actual performances at the final tribal itself. But for now, again, we're going to start off the winning final tribal performance ranking here at number 40. The worst final tribal performance from a winner has to be Bob Crowley. I mean, to me, it was even close. Bob is like the only person in the history of the show that I feel like gave his performance in a way that he wasn't even trying to win. He literally says in his opening statement that he doesn't think he outwitted or outplayed the jury, but he did outlast them. He pretty openly admits to just riding coattails and not really wanting to do anything differently, and kind of like just admitting that he didn't really do anything in the game. Gets into this argument with Kenny over whether or not he was telling the truth at the time regarding their deal, and again, all this is just not a great look. Now, while again the definition of lying would lead to Bob technically being in the right in this argument, it isn't a great look to be arguing with a jury member over whether or not you lied. And really, he just ends up bombing Kenny's question at the end of the day. He pretty much openly admits that people were making decisions for him, and he never had to make decisions. The only slight positives for his performance here is that he does kind of bury Sugar at points. He does blame Sugar for like the Randy move and talks about how he didn't like how Sugar was making fun of Randy, which I think could have led to him getting Randy's jury vote, though really I feel like he was naturally getting Randy's jury vote and would have needed to actively mess it up for him not to get Randy's jury vote, to a point where he almost did. And Bob's performance just screams out to me as someone that wasn't even really trying to win the game. I mean, obviously he was, but it's like he doesn't really actively go for the jugular at many points where he could have. He blatantly tells the jury that he didn't make any decisions in the game. He blatantly tells them that he didn't outwit them, he didn't outplay them, he just outlasted them. It just makes him seem like such a follower in the game. With him also bombing some other questions, I did feel like he had to land here in number 40. Now number 39 is another pretty bad final tribal council. One where I feel like this person loses votes at the actual tribal itself, which to be honest kind of makes it up for debate with Bob. Even though I do think Bob's performance as a whole is a lot worse, this person did get closer to losing the game from their final tribal, and that person is Ethan Zahn. Now, I do think overall Ethan does have a better performance than Bob during most questions, where I don't feel like Bob answers really any of his questions particularly well. I do feel like Ethan definitely has an easier time overall, but he does have some pretty bad answers, namely his answer to Brandon. I mean, I think this is one that is completely asinine, where again, he comes into Final Tribal thinking that Brandon is the swing vote, and then when Brandon asks him, who does he think is the least deserving to be there, which is a very clear indication that he wants Frank as the answer, which, to be fair, I don't think Ethan should have said Frank, as I do think that could have led to him losing Frank's answer. I do think his answer should have been someone probably like a Kim Powers, with Kim Powers probably being the least likely person to vote for him coming into this final tribal. But the fact that he just goes up and says Brandon in a position where he thinks that he's the swing vote is completely asinine, loses him Brandon's jury vote, and in his mind should have made it so that he lost the game. Thing is, though, is that his perception was wrong and he had more jury votes than he thought he did. But if his perception had been right, he loses the game based off of this question. I also feel like he kind of bombs a later question as well, where he's asked, who have you learned the most and the least from? Now, I do think when saying the most, he says T-Bird, which I don't think is the worst answer in the world. Actually, probably a decent one, considering T-Bird is one that he perceived to be someone that wasn't going to be voting for him. But then he goes on to answer Kelly as his least. I mean, at this point, he should have said Brandon. Again, he already bombed Brandon's question. Why not just say Brandon again? But instead, he says Kelly, kind of isolating another vote that he thought that we now know could have been a potential swing vote. I just feel like he gets the incorrect read from the jury in his question answering here. And that's really his main mistakes here. I do think outside of that, he does okay, especially for this time in Survivor. He does talk about integrity and wanting to prove that honest people can get to the end, which I do think based off the game he played isn't the worst argument. I do think in general, not the greatest thing to be saying, but I don't think his actual game contradicts that. And I do feel like that's not the worst thing to be saying here. Talks about how he regrets accusing someone so quickly for the rogue vote that happened at the merge vote. Again, like, I think those are all decent enough answers. I do think overall his performance is fine with the exception of those really bad answers. But again, like in comparison to all the other winners, it is one of the worst performances in my eyes. So he lands here number 39. Now number 38, another performance that again is pretty bad. And it's from a winner that I absolutely adore. I've openly talked about this person being my favorite Survivor player of all time. But here we do have Tony's performance from Survivor Cagayan, which is really bad, largely because he just doesn't own up to his game. It's like coming into this tribal, he was already winning the game, but so many people on the jury were very upset at him still and still wanted to air out their frustrations with him. He had people like Jeffra and LJ and even Trish coming up to him, to which he responds by trying to explain the move to them, essentially trying to put the blame on these people's boots on them instead of owning his own game. Again, like the LJ one in particular, I think is a pretty bad one, especially because like we know in real life that he's the one that put this target onto LJ, but he still goes with his in-game reason for getting rid of LJ, where he talks about how, oh, you wanted to go after Woo, so I had to save Woo and go after you. It's like, dude, why are you still lying in your final driver performance here? Also, Jeffra, he ends up getting into like a pretty big confrontation with her over him trying to explain his move. Again, not a great look there. Obviously, the Trish move is like the only one that he actually takes ownership of. He talks about how she's the only one that didn't backstab him first, which again, I do think also puts LJ and Jeffra in a worse light in that sense. Again, like I just don't think he handles LJ and Jeffra well at all in this final tribal, and is still very lucky that he gets their votes at the end of the day. And I think a lot of that is largely due to the fact that he was up against Woo. But even within the Trish answer, he does also start off with a lie as well, considering again, like outside the game, we know that he's the one that told Woo to go after Trish, but he explains it as if Woo was the one that come up with the plan. Again, he's just unnecessarily lying at this final tribal, while also trying to rationalize his moves to the jury, which I just think overall does not play well. And while it doesn't end up affecting any of the jury votes, because he still gets an 8-1 vote where that one vote in Tasha was never going to him, it is still not a great look, and something that I think definitely could have caused him to lose jury votes had this been an earlier season of the show. Now number 37, we're moving on to final tribal performance that I can see the argument for it being higher, but I also think there's a massive argument for being even lower, and that is the final tribal performance from Brian Heidik from Survivor Thailand. And Brian Heidik, to me, has two different sides of him at Final Tribal. I do think there is a side of him that actually performs pretty well when he answers questions. I do think he is a very smarmy individual. Again, he is a used car salesman. And I think that very much shows in the way he approaches a lot of his answers. And I do think you can say that, oh, he answers like this question well, he answers this question well, because like he is a salesman. Like that is the type of things that he does. He does answer these questions like a salesman. However, he also has a lot of really bad moments in this final tribal, particularly around Ken and Penny's question. Now, first up, Ken does ask him about the entire Ted situation, which again, if you don't know, what is speculated to have happened is that Brian assumed that Ken would be racist because he's a cop, so he went to Ken and said that they can't let Ted win because they can't let another black person win the game. To which obviously Ken found that offensive and tries to call him out for that at Final Tribal, but isn't actually willing to outright say it, and that is why he asks Brian the question of, do you want to own up to what you said? To which Brian kind of just stumbles around the answer. And I do think he gets very lucky that Ken just doesn't straight up blow up his spot right there. As I do think if that happened, I do think there's a chance Brian ends up losing the game. Also, I mean, I think the more egregious thing in terms of the final tribal performance is Penny. I mean, this is terrible. I mean, when Penny is straight up just asking him questions about her personal life, and like he just really doesn't know anything about her, and it's absolutely hilarious to watch. Again, really bad work there. I do think outside of that, his performance is fine. Again, like he does suck up to Jake. I think he does a good job there. He does a good job at like talking about how different he is from Clay, talking about how he's a provider, talking about how he's a doer. I do think his Helen answer can be a bit wonky. Again, like for me, it's like I do think Brian has certain elements of his performance that are okay, but I mean, there's still those two answers to me that are so bad, and that's why he lands here at number 37. And with that, I think we're out of the tier of like these actively bad final jury performances. Like, for me, the winners don't have that many outright terrible final jury performances, but we are kind of still in a tier of like somewhat mediocre ones. And we're starting it off at number 36 here. We have the first final trial performance that we're going to be talking about from Sandra. We have her final trial performance from Pearl Islands, which to me is this low, mainly because I don't think she has the greatest answers in the world. To be honest, for the most part, it's a very just kind of meh performance. Like, it's nothing actively wrong with it, but nothing actively great about it. But through this performance, she does end up losing a vote from Tijuana, which I think is the main reason why I end up putting her so low. She did come into Final Tribal winning in a 7-0 vote, but ends up losing Tijuana's vote along the way because of how passive she comes off at Final Tribal. I mean, she does talk about how she was always a team player, talks about how she didn't want to be the person to put together a vote, talks about not riding coattails, but also really attaching herself to Rupert and Krista, talks about not knowing that Rupert was going home. She does her typical Sandra move of blaming the jury for not listening to her about Johnny Fairplay, which again she later does in Heroes vs. Villains about Russell. And I do think overall it is more effective in Heroes vs. Villains than it is here. Literally tells the jury that Lil is responsible for every single person being on the jury, and that's why they should vote for Sandra instead. Again, like I feel like this is such a passive performance, while again I do think it is okay for at this point in Survivor history. It does lose her jury vote in Tijuana, and also I feel like it's a performance that simply doesn't work in the modern day. I feel like this is a straight up losing Final Tribal performance in the modern day that isn't respected. But because it is an older school season, and also the fact that she's up against Lil, someone that was already voted out, it doesn't end up completely harming her chances of winning. But it's just overall performance I don't find that impressive, and then along with the fact that she loses the jury vote, for me it had to land here at number 36. Now number 35, we're on to a performance that I've always found pretty mediocre. Another earlier Final Tribal performance in the history of the show, and that is the performance of Tina Wesson from Survivor of the Australian Outback. Now, for me, both Tina and Colby completely bomb their Final Tribal performances, and obviously Tina ends up performing better than Colby in my eyes. And I feel like because that, I always thought Tina's performance is better than what it was, but again, just in comparison to all these other winning performances, hers is pretty bad. I really hate her opening statement where she talks to the jury about how they shouldn't vote because they got their feelings hurt, which to me is not a great look. I just feel like a lot of that just comes off as really demeaning to the jury. I also feel like she kind of contradicts herself throughout Tribal, where she talks about how she played with strategy and how strategy is unethical, but then also talks about how her least proud moment in the game is talking about how she voted out people, which again, I don't think is a great look there. I do feel like she kind of wastes her opportunity during certain questions, particularly when she's asked of like name the two jury members who you would exclude from the money. And she does answer Roger, which I don't think is the worst answer in the world, and then says Jerry, who I do think is a bad answer. One, as Jerry was pretty openly a swing vote here. I do think Jerry was very clearly one of the people that was in the middle. So to say Jerry for this answer was not great. Now, Colby also said Jerry, so it kind of evens itself out, but this is definitely a wasted opportunity in my eyes. And even the Roger one, like to me, the answer should have been Amber and Nick. I feel like they were the two least likely people to vote for Tina at this Final Tribal, but she kind of just ends up saying Roger and Jerry, who I do think were more likely to vote for her. Also, when asked from who from Kucha would have gotten to the end, I do think she also wastes her answer with saying Scoopin, who was again not on the jury, when again she should have said people that were on the jury. When asked about what she feels the worst about, she does answer the beef jerky situation. Again, another wasted opportunity of Why are you mentioning this thing that like half of the jury hasn't even seen? And for me, it's really a final tribal of a lot of wasted opportunities and a lot of just Tina being on a high horse, which I do think is one of the bigger issues with Tina in the grand scheme of Survivor, as we've seen a similar thing on Blood vs. Water as well. So for those things, for me, she lands here number 35. Now number 34, we have another early final tribal performance here. We do have the performance from Vascepia, which I think is another one of these that isn't like actively bad, but also not really that impressive at the end of the day either. I do think she does give some very wonky answers here, namely with Kathy. I do think she handles Kathy pretty poorly here, where she doesn't end up really even answering Kathy's question, kind of just walks around it, which causes Kathy to be pretty upset with her. And really, it feels like she does that a lot here, where she does the same thing with the general's question, where she kind of just walks around it for a while, but eventually she does get the right answer. But again, it's still like not the greatest look here. I mean, she talks about how she didn't write coattails and how she's playing with strategy. Again, your typical answers here. Nothing overly impressive, with like a couple like minor knocks there. I do think she has some wasted opportunities. Namely in her final plea, she doesn't even really bother giving one. She really just tells the jury they like consider what we've already said, and it's like that's really nothing. To be honest, I don't really have that much to say about Vasepia's performance here. Again, it's really just one that was like mostly just average, with some wishy-washiness at points, and her really not handling Kathy's question that well. And that's a lot of the reason why she's as low as she is here at number 34. Now, number 33, we're moving on to a bit more of a recent Final Tribal performance. The first one in the new Final Tribal format, which I will say that I do think the new Final Tribal format leads to better Final Tribal performances, where they do give each player the opportunity to truly explain their games. But I do feel like this player kind of wasted that opportunity. And at number 33 here, we do have the winner of Survivor, HHH. We have Ben Driebergen, who is kind of just there for a lot of the tribal. I mean, a lot of the final tribal is Ryan versus Chrissy, while Ben just kind of sits in the background and doesn't really end up saying that much. And I do feel like most of the times when he's talking, like he ends up getting undercut by one of those other two along the way. I mean, he does talk about how he tried to paint a target on Cole because like Cole was great in challenges and everything, and he says it was a strategic move, but then Ryan undercuts him and says it wasn't a strategic move. He actually hated Cole. His final statements were very underwhelming, to the point where even Joe talks about how he's disappointed by it. He does do the obvious thing here of saying that, oh, I took every one of you out, I was one step ahead on idols and stuff. And it's like, again, that's what you would expect Ben to do here. But I do feel, again, this is another one of just so many wasted opportunities, where during most of his answers, he does end up getting undercut, while in other ones, he just doesn't seem to be fighting that hard, which is really ironic considering how hard Ben fought in the game before this. To me, I think this is one of those situations where, again, like Ben was already winning coming into Final Tribal. I don't think this Final Tribal performance really ended up changing anything, but I do think his passiveness here did lead to Ryan and Chrissy being able to explain their games better, which could have led to them getting more votes, and probably did lead to Devin voting for Ryan. So, again, at the end of the day, I don't really look at Ben's performance here as, again, anything that massively wrong. It's just that I don't feel like he really took that many of the opportunities that he had here, and because he lands at number 33. Now, number 32, moving on to another Final Tribal performance. Not a really bad one, but also one with a couple like wonky answers, and that is the performance from Aris from Survivor Panama. Now, I do think for the most part, he does perform fine. I mean, he does talk about how he worked hard in challenges and at camp, which I think was the main reason why he was already getting the votes to begin with. Talks about how Sari contributed the most to his game and helped him strategically. Talks about how he wants to change himself as a person and become a better person to inspire other people. Again, not bad answers entirely. I did like how when asked why people should vote for Danielle, his answer was because she helped me after I injured myself earlier today. And again, that was like just such a nothing answer, which was funny to me. But I will say that, again, there are a couple answers to me that are kind of iffy. When asked of like, what are you the most proud of? He talks about telling Melinda she was going home, which is just such a terrible answer. One, because telling Melinda she was going home was a bad strategic move to begin with. But also, it's a thing that happened in the pre-merge in a situation where the majority of the people on the jury had not seen what he had done. Another thing I didn't like is how much he preaches on integrity, to the point where the jury even laughs at him when he talks about integrity. And I do think him harping on that is just not a good look overall. That being said, though, again, I think most of his performance is solid, It's just those couple sticking points to me that do put him here at number 32. Now, number 31 is a performance that I've seen people rank very highly as like one of the best performances ever, and I really just don't see it. And that is the winning performance from Amber from Survivor All-Stars. Again, like, I don't get what people are seeing when they say that this is one of the best Final Tribal performances, because I feel like this is a performance that is so reliant on people being bitter at Rob. And like, does she play into that? Yes, to a degree. I do think she does answer certain questions that can stoke some bitterness, but it's like, I do feel like for the most part, she just kind of gets lucky. Nothing really here screams out as anything too special. When asked why is she there, she does say because of luck and her alliance with Rob, which I actually think is a decent answer. While I do think saying that you're solely there because of luck is not a great answer, I do think mentioning the luck factor at Final Tribal is not the worst scenario based on how you approach it. And I don't think this is the worst approach here. Though she does end up mentioning it numerous times over the course of Final Tribal, which I don't think is the greatest look. Really, a lot of her Final Tribal performance is talking about how she stuck true to Rob and how she genuinely fell for Rob. And it's like, that's fine. But again, when we're talking about a jury that actively hates Rob, I don't think that's necessarily the things you want to be saying. Now, I do think she does stoke Tom's bitterness a bit when Tom asks her why he should vote for her. And she says because Rob betrayed him more, which is like, again, fine. But again, it's really a performance that's largely relying on Rob sucking more so than her actively doing well here. To me, Amber's performance is just overall kind of fine. So for that, I don't feel like I can justify putting her much higher here than number 31. Now, number 30 is a performance that I actually thought was going to be higher on the list. I actually thought this performance was solid. It's just, again, I just think others are better. And here we do have the winning trial performance from Jenna from Survivor the Amazon, who, again, I think for the most part answers her questions pretty well. I do think she comes off as pretty strong and intelligent through her answers. I do question her talking about how she played morally during her opening questions. It's like, why? Especially because, like, you mentioned right after that you talked about lying to Dina. It's, again, like, why are you bothering to talk about how you played with morals? Like, it just opens up the opportunity for people to look at you as a hypocrite. I think the only real adversity she faces during this Final Tribal is her question from Christy, to which I think she handles it okay. I do feel like she could have probably answered it a bit more strongly, but it's overall a decent response. I do think she undercuts Matthew a few times, talking about how Matthew hasn't played the entire game and kind of just tagged along. I did like her answer to Dave's question, where Dave asks her to compare herself to a modern leader, and she kind of just neglects the question to start talking about her mom, which I do think is probably the best way to answer that question, as it shows the other players the emotional side of her. Like, I do think for the most part, again, it is a solid performance. I do think she does waste a couple opportunities, largely with Dina, where I do feel like Dina is someone that was a potential swing vote here, and I do feel like she doesn't really take the opportunity to try to sway Dina's vote. And while she does get it at the end of the day anyway, there are many opportunities where she should have propped up Dina where she didn't. But outside of that, again, like, overall, pretty solid performance. She's here at 30. At number 29, a pretty similar performance in my eyes, and that is the winning performance from Michele Fitzgerald from Survivor Co. Wrong. Again, an overall pretty solid performance. Like, there's nothing actively wrong with her performance here. It's just, again, I just feel like others are stronger at the end of the day. I do like her main talking point over the course of this tribal, where she talks about how being on the beauty tribe kind of put her at a disadvantage, as that put her in a position to where she needed to prove that she had brains and brawn. She kind of puts the blame on her being on the outskirts of her alliance on Julia not being trusted, which I do think makes it seem like she had more agency in the game than what she really did. I do think she explains why Jason got voted out pretty well there, where she does talk about how she had more control within the majority group than Ty, which again isn't true, but I do think she sells it pretty well here. Talks about how she was underestimated in terms of her intelligence within the game. She does get emotional during her final words, which I do think is always a good look for the jury. I overall think this is a pretty solid performance. I don't think it's anything that special at the end of the day, but it is still one that is pretty effective. Though, again, at the end of the day, I do think she probably wins the game either way. But still, I decided to land her here at number 29. At number 28, we have another Final Tribal performance that, again, very similar thing. Very solid performance the entire way through. Very little issues, but also very little really high points over the course of this performance. And that is the performance from Dani Boatwright from Survivor Guatemala. Now, Dani here does talk a lot about how no one looked at her as a threat, and she was able to use her social game to align with Rafe and Stephanie. Talks about how she thought there was going to be no chance of her getting to the end due to the numbers being against her, but overcame those odds. Again, like, has this typical underdog Final Tribal performance, again, similar to what we had from like a Jenna or a Michele. To me, what puts her above Michele and Jenna is I do think she butters up the jury a little bit better, particularly with people like a Bobby John, saying that she wished that her tribe could have came into the merge with the numbers so that Bobby John could have made it further into the game. Tells Gary the reason he shouldn't vote for her is because she played selfishly, which I think is really just a nothing answer. And I do think she effectively points out that Rafe is not going to vote for her from the beginning, and does throw Rafe under the bus at points to where, again, it doesn't really take anything off of her back, as, again, she already knows Rafe's not voting for her, so it doesn't really matter. Like, she says that if she were to take out jury members, she would have taken out Rafe. I do think her performance like completely isolates Rafe, but also she was kind of banking on her not needing Rafe's vote to begin with. But I do think she does pretty well with almost every other jury member, and also I think she effectively explains her strategy over the course of the season. So for me, she lands at number 28. And now number 27, we're on to a Final Tribal performance that I actually thought was really good on the rewatch. I thought this was actually a pretty good performance, and I thought it was going to end up being pretty high, but obviously more and more Final Tribal performances happen, and this person ends up dropping pretty low here. But at number 27, we have the original winner of Survivor. We do have Richard Hatch. And again, I thought Richard Hatch performed okay. Like, I mean, I was actually surprised at how decent I thought his performance was. Now, I will say that at the end of the day, he does lose jury votes from this performance. He does lose both Jervis and Colleen, who are both planning on voting for him coming into Final Tribal, which isn't good. But I do think some of that can be factored in with Sue and the Snakes and Rats speech over things that Rich actively did. Like, I feel like this is a performance that works well in the modern landscape of the game, or at least works better. I mean, I do think there are certain elements that doesn't. Again, he does talk about how he played as ethically as possible, which I do think is technically true from Richard's standpoint. Again, probably not the greatest look there, but I do think overall he does articulate his strategy pretty well over the course of this Final Tribal. I do think he really shows an understanding of the game through his answer to Colleen, where he talks about how observation and self-awareness allowed him to get through the game, to which he gets called out by Colleen as like he didn't know anything about a lot of the individual players over the course of that Fallen Comrades competition. But then he like explains how he was observing the social dynamics of the game. Again, I think it really comes off as pretty articulate here. I think he comes off pretty well. But the reason why he's not higher on the list is because, again, like at the end of the day, he does lose jury votes over the course of this Final Tribal. And also, I just feel like, obviously, other Final Tribal performances are a lot more impressive at the end of the day. But I do think, considering this is the first season, he does perform pretty well. I mean, like, even on the question of who do you wish was at the final two instead of you, like, he answers Greg, which I think is a great answer considering Greg was a swing vote. Like, I mean, I think overall he does do pretty well here. So because I do have him here at number 27. At number 26, we have a performance that, to be honest, I've never been that impressed by. I actually definitely consider putting this person lower. But at the end of the day, like, it still is a solid performance. That is the performance of Tom Westman from Survivor Palau. Now, for me, so much of this Fallen Tribal is reliant on Katie kind of being bashed on, to the point where I feel like Tom and his answers kind of become less prominent to me. Now, Tom does talk a lot about how the tribe was a family and how he provided for them, and talks about how he won challenges and all the typical stuff that you would expect someone like Tom Westman to say. I do think he comes off a bit self-righteous at points, particularly with Colby, where like he shakes his head when Colby says he played dirty, and does do a lot of apologizing over the course of this Final Tribal. Apologizes to like Greg for believing Ian and having to blindside him. Talks to Stephanie about how she was his ace in the hole and how he had to vote her out to keep the alliance together. Talks to Karen about how he never lied to her because he technically never made alliance with her. And again, like, these are all like technically good answers, but I just wish that Tom kind of owned his game a bit more. To me, it just very much comes off as him kind of just creating excuses for the moves that he made. I think he overall answers these questions pretty well. I just don't really feel like he owns his game in a way that I would personally like him to, and that's a lot of the reason why I do have him here at number 26. Now, number 25, a performance that I would actually say is kind of the complete opposite of Tom, and that is the winner of Survivor 25, and that is Denise Stapley. Tom kind of tries to downside the amount that he played the game, while I feel like Denise tries to overstate how much she played the game, where she talks about how she won't apologize for any of the moves that she made, or she talks about how much she created alliances and sub-alliances, which I don't think she actually did that much of. She talks about how she outplayed and outlasted all of them. Talks about how she was forced to play a more strategic game, which again, I don't think she played that much of a strategic game. I do think she very much overstates how much she played. Now, obviously, she does have the good talking points of her having to survive every single tribal. She talks about how she had to assimilate within multiple tribes and prove that she had value. Again, all good enough answers. Talks about how she should beat the other two because they didn't have to play the strategic game that she played, which again, I don't think is entirely true, and it works for her. I don't love her response to Abby, where Abby just simply wants an apology from her, and Denise responds, well, I apologize if you felt dehumanized. Again, it's again, not a great way to apologize there. But overall, I do feel like this final trial performance was effective. I do think she got her point across, even though I do think she very much overstates her game, and I do think she has some iffy responses, but I do think for the most part, her performance is solid. But again, I just feel like there's others that are better. So for me, she lands at number 25. Now number 24, which for me, this is kind of the end of the fine tier. I feel like beyond this performance, I think we're on to all pretty good performances. But I do feel like this is the last one that I do feel like I have some hesitancies with, and that person is Tyson Apostle. Now, I think the first thing that Tyson does in this final tribal is pretty good, in the fact that he brings up Rachel getting voted out and how he changed his game because of that, and then starts also crying about it. It's I do feel like overall that is a very good look for him, and also talks about how he made huge moves, talks about how he found idols in order to make sure that no one else had them, talks about how he does nothing out of malice, which I do think is probably not the greatest thing to say, considering there is a very easy rebuttal here, to which Katie very clearly rebuts him later on, where again, during the rock situation, he ends up telling Katie that her jury seat is over there. Again, not a great look, and something that easily comes off as hypocritical here, though he does end up saying that that was his only regret in the game. I do think another answer I don't particularly love from him is when he was asked, is he the villain of the season? He says that he doesn't see himself as the villain, as everything he did was strategic, so he guess he has to be the hero. Again, not a great response. Again, it doesn't feel like he's really owning up to his game there. And also, I don't love the response later on where he's asked, say one word that describes how you play the game, and he said fun-loving, which I feel like, again, there's much better answers to be given there. But again, I feel like overall his performance outside of that was pretty good. Again, I think him relating his game back to Rachel getting voted out was pretty good. I do think him talking about his finding of idols and him making moves, I do think that was good. I do like him talking about how he was always one step ahead of Hayden. I did also like how when asked who would you vote for between Monica and Jervis, he does end up pointing to Monica, which I do think is probably the correct decision for him. Again, overall for me, solid performance. Couple hesitancies there that do leave him here at number 24. At number 23 here, we're moving on to a very recent Final Tribal performance. Again, another one within the modern Final Tribal format. And here we do have the performance from Chris Underwood. Now, Chris, for me, has a very weird performance here, where I do think for the most part he does perform pretty well. I mean, I think the one notable part of his Final Tribal performance is him talking about a Lauren move and him getting Lauren to waste her idol, talking about the negative reverse. I feel like that's a very, very good look for him to the jury, especially a jury that is so game savvy. I do think that just puts him in a really good light there. I do like, obviously, him explaining each of his moves, talking about at 6, he got Lauren to waste her idol. At 5, he played an idol successfully. At 4, he gave up his immunity necklace to take on Rick Devens. Again, all really good stuff there, but I also feel like a lot of it is just kind of baseline. Or again, outside the negative reverse comment, I do feel like a lot of his performance is just kind of there. It's kind of just blatant. I do like him talking about this arc of him always wanting to play a perfect game and having to let go of that goal, but playing the best possible game he could do. Again, I think that's a very good thesis for his Final Tribal performance. I think overall, again, it is a solid Final Tribal performance. I do think he does go a bit hard on Gavin at points, particularly in a position where he kind of irritates both Lauren and Wentworth. Mind you, I think they were always voting for Gavin over Chris. Like, I don't think he was ever getting either of their votes, but I do think him going so hard on Gavin at a point does cause them to get a bit irritated, which is not the greatest look. And then also with the rest of his performance just being kind of baseline. For me, I decided to put him kind of on the lower end here of the good performances. He lands number 23. At number 22, kind of a similar thing. Again, an overall very good performance, but one that does kind of annoy certain people here and there. And that performance comes from Jeremy Collins from Survivor Cambodia. Now, the thing that definitely puts him above Chris to me is that I do think he gains a vote at Final Tribal here. Again, he was always winning the game. He was going to win the game in a 9-1-0 vote. He does get that other one vote from Sierra through his performance. Mind you, I think a lot of that comes from his reveal that Val was pregnant, which I do feel like is something that is a bit more variant, considering that's obviously not a plea that he can always give, but I do think he effectively gives that plea at the end with him talking about his family and how he's doing this for his family. Again, for the most part, I do feel like his performance here is mostly just okay. I do feel like there are a couple points where like I'm kind of just like thinking he's not really doing the best with his answers. Like, I think particularly when asked about the Kimmy situation, him being perceived to be arrogant when voting out Kimmy, he talks about how he didn't believe Kimmy flipped, and when he realized that, he was like, shame on you, Kimmy. And it's like, yeah, like overall, I just don't feel like that's a great look there. I do think he also props up Spencer a bit too much over the course of his final trial, where he talks about Spencer was making a lot of moves and talks about how intelligent he is. But again, overall, like, it is a just pretty baseline performance that does have one massive pro in the fact that he does end up flipping Sierra's vote. Again, he gains a vote through his final tribal performance. And while there are a couple things I just don't love from his performance, I do feel like overall it is a net positive, and he does land here at number 22. At number 21, back to a modern season, back to a final trial performance with the modern format, and here we do have Wendell's performance from Ghost Island. Now, for me, Wendell has a performance that I do feel like is one that has some wasted potential to it. I do feel like most of the time when Wendell is giving his answers, Dom does successfully undercut him during most points. I mean, for me personally, I feel like Dom's final tribal performance would have worked on me a lot better than Wendell's. That being said, Wendell's performance kind of wins him the game. I mean, coming into that final tribal, Dom had 5 locked votes, 2 votes leaning towards him, while Wendell only had 3 votes in his favor. He needed to get both Angela and Chelsea to go on his side. His performance does successfully get Chelsea to go on his side, and he does then need Angela, to which is kind of attributed to kind of a fluke, where again, like Angela's talked about how she voted for Wendell because she was looking at the jury and Wendell ended up looking at her at the same time, and she realized that she needed to vote for Wendell. Again, a very fluky thing. But I mean, at the end of the day, like, his performance here at Final Tribal does flip over 2 votes that leads them getting to a tie, which is what he needed to win the game. Like, while I don't think his actual performance was the greatest in the world, I mean, he does successfully flip over votes to win the game. That is impressive. But again, like, when looking at his performance, I do think he gives some credit to Dom, where he does talk about how Dom was the one that was making the moves and he was kind of in the background. Now, he does set himself up for being the mastermind, the manipulator behind the scenes, to which Dom ends up laughing at him. And I think Dom successfully undercuts him. Now, I do think there was already this sentiment on the jury that Wendell could be the mastermind, which is, I think, why Kellen and eventually Chelsea kind of leaned towards voting for Wendell by the end of it. But again, I guess you have to credit that to some of Wendell's performance here. But also, I feel like Wendell kind of tries to take credit for things that were easily dismissible, largely him pulling over Donathan and Laurel, which was very easy for him to be proven wrong, where Donathan himself calls Wendell out, saying that no, it was Dom that put me into the alliance. He does also talk about loyalty here, which, like, I don't know how that works. I mean, like, I think it works effectively on people like Kellen and Sebastian and Donathan, but I don't think it works effectively on the people that were already voting for Dom, in people like a Chris Noble, people like a Michael Yerger, people like a Jenna or Desiree. Like, I don't think it works on them. Like, and that's the thing about Wendell that I find very tough to assess with his final trial performance, is I do think his final trial performance is very effective for around half of the tribe, but very ineffective for the other half. But at the end of the day, he only needed that half in order to win the game. But because he was effective in getting that half of the jury to vote on his side, I did feel like it was worthy enough to be here at number 21. Now at number 20, we're moving on to Final Tribal performance. I'll be honest, I have very little to say about because this person had almost no time to actually talk at Final Tribal. This is one of the most rushed Final Tribals in the history of the show. But there are a couple notable points here, and at number 20, I do have Mike Holloway. Now again, Mike barely got to answer any questions, but I feel like his answers here were overall pretty solid. He does talk about how he does wish he did better socially in the game and admits to his failure in that, but does talk about how he did try to make genuine bonds along the way. I do think the main point here of what makes him as high on the list as he is right now is him getting Dan's vote. Again, Dan came into Tribal being very bitter at Mike, and Mike is effectively able to apologize to Dan to the point where Dan ends up flipping his vote. Again, he gains Dan's vote here due to his apology, and I do think that is a massive pro for me. That does put him in this like good tier of Final Tribals. Again, I have nothing actively bad to say about Mike's performance here because there isn't much of a performance to really talk about, but I do feel like that one massive pro ends up putting him here at number 20. Now at number 19, we're moving on to a tribal performance that I know a lot of people have said is one of the best of all time. Again, kind of similar to an Amber situation where like I don't really see it. Like I see this is good. This is a good performance. I think this is definitely better than Amber's, as you can see by the placement on the list. But for me, I just feel like there's so many other ones that are much stronger. And here at number 19, we do have Natalie White. Now, I do think Natalie White does a pretty good job at kind of coming off as the counterpoint to Russell. While Russell's talking about all these strategic moves he made and how he dominated the game, Natalie kind of comes off as a good counterpoint to that. She does talk about how she needed to play more passively, how she was smart enough to see that the aggressive females in the game were going home. It talks about how she grew over the course of this experience, like gaining confidence and going out of her comfort zone. Talks about killing a rat. Like I feel like all this stuff is pretty solid. Like I think all this is pretty good work on a Final Tribal performance here. But for me, it's nothing really that outstanding. I don't feel like she undercuts Russell as much as I would like her to. Like, while again, like I think she props up her game a decent amount, I do feel like there's another performance that we'll talk about a little bit later that does more of an effective job at winning over a bitter jury than someone like a Natalie's here. Now again, Natalie's for me is still pretty strong. It's still here in the top half of the list, but for me, I just feel like others are more actively good in their Final Tribal performance. But for me, I just feel like there are other Final Tribal performances that I find more impressive. So because that Natalie lands here at number 19. Now at number 18, we're having that Final Tribal performance that I just mentioned. We have the second winning performance from Sandra Diaz, her performance from Heroes versus Villains. And for me, this is a pretty perfect example of someone playing up to a bitter jury. Like, I do feel like she really plays up to the jury how much she hates Russell and how much she tried to get Russell out and how much she failed because the jury wouldn't go on her side, which I think can play out in two possible ways. I think one, the jury could be insulted that she's doing this, but I do think in this season, she does have the correct read that doing this will gain her their jury votes. I do like that she admits that her strategy over the course of the season wasn't that good because, again, she talks about if it was better, she wouldn't have Russell beside her. Which, again, I don't think is a good look for a modern season of the show, but I do think for Survivor 20, where, again, a lot of these people were very emotional in their decision-making, I do feel like that was the correct call to make. Really just puts a lot of the blame on Russell being in the game onto the villains and talking about how, again, they wouldn't listen to her. Talks about how she's the sole surviving member from her original alliance, which I think that also adds to her underdog story. Again, like, overall, I just feel like this is a very effective jury performance to undercut a dominant player, especially one that is already very disliked by the jury. I just feel like Sandra, just for the most part here, is very effective in what she's trying to do. So because of that, she lands here at number 18. Now number 17, onto another performance. I'll be honest, I thought this one would be higher. I thought coming into this list, I remember this performance being very strong, but I do feel like on the rewatch, I feel like he does get undercut quite a bit, and that person is Fabio. Now, Fabio is someone that I think when I think of his Final Tribal performance, I think of how genuine he comes off the jury, and particularly with someone like a Nayanka. I remember when he answers Nayanka's question, he actually makes the jury cry when talking about how much he loves his mother. The problem I have with Fabio's performance nowadays is, one, Chase and Sash very clearly undercut him numerous times over the course of the Final Tribal. pretty much talking about how he had no clue what was going on in the game, which is entirely true, which doesn't entirely work on the majority of the jury, but I do think plays a factor in him losing jury votes, which is another reason why he's as low as he is here. He does technically lose 2 jury votes over the course of Final Tribal. He comes into Final Tribal winning 7-2. He does lose both Alina and Brenda's votes over the course of Final Tribal. That's also pretty bad. But again, I do think his performance here is a pretty good underdog performance. He does very much differentiate himself from Chase and Sash. He does effectively play up to the jury's emotions. So that does make him land as low as he is, as I do think outside of that, his performance is probably overall borderline top 10. But for me, because of his loss of jury votes, he does land here at number 17. Now, number 16 is another Final Tribal performance of, again, someone that was, again, effectively able to create themselves as the counterpoint to another player, which I do think is kind of a staple of this portion of the list. And here at number 16, we do have Yule. Again, I think Yule was able to successfully create himself as the alternate option to Ozzy, where Ozzy obviously portrays himself as this very emotional person, this person that did very well in challenges. Yule portrays himself as the strategic mastermind of the season and someone that grew over the course of the season, talks about how he found self-confidence, talks about how he wanted to represent minorities on TV. Like, I do think all that is pretty good. I do think he articulates his strategy pretty well, talking about how he needed to use Ozzy as a target in front of him. Talks about how the deceiving and manipulating doesn't go beyond the game itself, while also talking about how he remained true to his original alliances. He does admit that he lied throughout the game and says that he couldn't have gotten through the game if he didn't lie. Like, I mean, I think overall this is a pretty solid performance as a whole. Again, I think it's him admitting to the level of strategy that he was able to play within the game while not coming off as this massive scumbag along the way, which I do think is something that is pretty important this early on in Survivor's history. He does get called out for pandering to the jury. And I will say that there's also probably some fault in the fact that he only gets 5 out of the 9 votes. I think you can fault him for not getting some of those other votes that were up for grabs, especially from people that neither him or Ozzy ever met, particularly into people like a Rebecca. And like, he technically had met Jenny in the past and didn't get Jenny's vote. Again, there's some very wonky jury votes there, but overall, I do think he effectively sets himself up as a counterpoint to Yule, as for someone that the more strategically minded people should be voting for, and because he does land here at number 16. Now, number 15, we're back to a modern winner of the show, and here we do have the winner of Survivor David vs. Goliath. We have Nick. Now, for me, Nick's Final Tribal performance is just all around good. Like, it's very good with very little flaws, but I also feel like has very few outright standout moments. Now, I did like his opening statement where he does talk about his game being about information and timing, talking about how he got information from all the social bonds that he was able to build. Talks about a strategy of naming alliances, and through that knew when every move was being made, which is not entirely accurate, but again, good for the jury. He also talks about timing, particularly with the John Hennigan move, which is obviously his best move in the season, making that minority vote split. Again, very good move there. Talks about how he put his own fate into his own hands, which I typically don't like when players say this. Like, if it was me on the jury, I would be saying, so essentially you played poorly, because essentially what that means is that you had to win out to get to the end. But again, it works well enough for most juries. Again, most juries don't look at the game of Survivor in the way that I do, and because I do think this was effective from their eyes. Talks about how he had to face adversity with him getting a bad tribe swap and losing all of his David allies. He does talk about his struggles from his childhood with his mom dying from a drug overdose. And like, I do think he effectively sets up his underdog story for a reason why people would want to vote for him, while also setting up the things that he did in the game, such as the John Hennigan move and him creating all these one-on-one relationships that want them to vote for him for being a strategic player within the game. Like, I think he does the best of both worlds. I do think overall this is a pretty solid Final Tribal performance. I just don't feel like there's anything overly great about it at the end of the day. It's mainly just one that is consistently strong, but it's also one that I feel like, again, like he was probably winning coming into it anyway, and doesn't really do anything to change people's minds. And if anything, he doesn't get the votes of people like a Christian, which is something that he should have gotten to begin with. So it's like, for me, he lands here number 15. Now, at number 14, we have another Final Tribal performance from a more recent season. And I do think overall, I would say that I actually think Nick's performance is probably more consistent the entire way through. But I do think this person had more adversity in their final tribal, and that person is Sarah Lacina. Now, Sarah comes into final tribal with most of the jury being very bitter at her and being unsure if they want to vote for her. And I do think she does a very effective job at getting people like an Andrea and Aubrey, these people that were, again, bitter at her, to respect the game that she played. I do think she very impressively articulates her game over the course of this final tribal through talking about how she was able to play the way that she played, again, being a completely different person from how she is in real life, through her experience working undercover as a cop, and talks about how she learned so much from her first season. She really owns her game and how much she lied and how much she blindsided people. She really expertly articulates her Sierra move and talks about how she got the legacy advantage. She talks about how paying attention to detail is what got her to vote steal at Michele's feet, which I think also impressed the jury. Talks about how she had to strike first and talks about how the jury probably would have beaten her if they got to the end, again, giving them credit along the way. Talks about how hard it was to play against such a high caliber cast here. And I do think overall, again, I think her performance is pretty strong. She does win over votes over the course of this final tribal. Again, while I do think Nick really sets up a much better argument for why he should win than Sarah does, I do feel like Sarah really articulates her game better than Nick was able to, and was able to actively win over votes along the way. So for me, that's why I have Sarah above him here at number 14. Now, number 13 is a performance that I did not think was going to be this high, and I actually really wanted to put it lower. But the main reason I did put it as high as it is here is because I have no real faults with this final tribal performance. And that's kind of the point in the list that we're at this point, where I think from this point forward, these are all really great final tribal performances that have very little downsides to them. It's mostly about which one is more impressive to me at the end of the day. But I feel like with this one here at number 13, this is one that I'm not as impressed by, but more so just don't have any real overwhelming flaws with, and that person is Natalie Anderson. Now, I think Natalie, for me, the main things that stick out to me with her performance is I do think she does an effective job at getting Alex's vote. I think Alex's answer is a very transparent answer in saying to Alec that her biggest move in the game was getting rid of Alec. But I do think it is very effective work to where Alec just completely eats it up. And I think she does an effective job at articulating why that was the best move for her, in talking about how keeping Keith around allowed her to get rid of John and Baylor in the upcoming rounds. She again does a good job at articulating this arc that she goes through over the course of the season with Nadia going home first and talking about how that changed the way she had to play the game. Again, something I do think is very effective on Blood vs. Water seasons. Talks about how she had to make really risky decisions while out there, which is kind of ironic considering her win is that war game, but either way, good over the course of this season. Again, like I just have no real faults with her performance here. I think she's overall pretty strong, handles the jury pretty well the entire way through, seems to be on everyone's good side the entire way through, and because of that, she lands at number 13. Now, number 12, we're on to a performance that I think is pretty good. I think the main reason this person's not higher is because I think the other person effectively undercuts him at points, but I don't think that takes away much from his actual performance itself. And here we do have the winner of Survivor Island of the Idols. We do have Tommy, and I think Tommy's performance is pretty good. Again, like Tommy effectively sells his game of him playing a more social game, him having a lot of control within the game through his social relationships, and him not needing to make big moves and not needing advantages in order to make big moves. Again, I think the one downside here is, again, I think Dean effectively undercuts him at points, really makes a bigger show of this final tribal in a way that I do think can be looked at more positively from a jury standpoint. But I think Tommy, again, effectively demonstrates his game here. I think he talks about using social shields and people like a Janet and Elizabeth. Talks about manipulating Nora into not putting himself in fire. Talks about not winning challenges and not winning idols, as he does believe that those were curses in the game. He talks about how he always knew about where all the advantages were from like Janet's idol and Dean's nullifier that allowed that move to happen to begin with. Undercuts Dean in saying that all Dean has is souvenirs and how he didn't make any moves with his advantages. He really props up Karishma pretty well and praising her for using her idol while also using that to undercut Dean. I think overall this is a very strong final tribal performance. I think one that, again, I think Tommy faces a decent amount of adversity here from Dean actively undercutting his performance the entire way through, but I think Tommy kind of gets the better of him throughout the final tribal despite all of that. I think the one downside I would say for Tommy is I do think he gets caught in a bit of a lie in him saying that he was loyal to Lauren to the end, to which Nora ends up rebutting that. But again, I think he effectively still gets Lauren's vote at the end of the day, to the point where Lauren is talking about how happy she is to be voting for him at the end. So it's like, overall, I think Tommy's performance is pretty good, but I do think him getting undercut here and there puts him a bit lower on the list here, puts him at number 12. Now number 11, a pretty similar Final Tribal performance in my eyes. Again, one that I think is a really strong performance, but one that does get undercut along the way, but still ends up being really effective. At number 11, we do have Adam Klein here. And Adam is one that I will admit, I got pretty frustrated when watching this Final Tribal performance, in the sense that I don't actually agree with a lot of what Adam says here. I do think Adam really ends up bashing on Hannah and Ken's game over the course of this Final Tribal in a way that, again, like, I actually agree with a lot of what Hannah did in the end game of this season. And I think a lot of the reason why she doesn't win is just because she's Hannah and the perception that she already had from the jury's eyes. But I actually do agree with the moves that Hannah made in terms of keeping David around from a positioning standpoint for Hannah personally. But Adam continuously undercuts her along the way. And to be fair, he is effective in that. And that is why he is as high on this list, is because he is effective in what he is doing. He does win the jury vote in a 10-0-0 vote. Now, I mean, he was supposedly always going to win in an overwhelming fashion. But again, he does effectively do well at this Final Tribal. He does come off as very, very aggressive and does face off some adversity through both Hannah and Ken fighting back with him at multiple points. And again, he's still able to effectively get the jury to believe his side of the story, even though I don't even think his side of the story is true. I do believe Ken and Hannah had more impressive maneuvers through the game in my eyes. However, again, Adam is effectively able to sell it. And that is what keeps Adam pretty high here. Yeah, I feel like he really fakes a lot of the agency that he has here, where he talks about, oh, I had 3 big threats at the final 6, and I had a challenge beast on my side to take them all out. But it's like, you were trying to get both David and Jay out before the final 6 at points. It's like, again, like, I think he just lies through his teeth through a lot of his performance. But again, it works and it's effective. And that is why he is as high as he is here at number 11. Now, number 10, we're on to what I would consider the top of this penultimate tier. I think from this point on, I feel like every performance is top tier, either in the sense that they won the game through their Final Tribal performance and had a very strong Final Tribal performance, or were able to pacify their jury in a pretty dominant way in a position where they were already winning the game. This person is the last one to not really fit into either of those, and that is the winning performance from Parvati Shallow from Survivor Micronesia. Now, there was definitely a point where she was a lot higher on the list. There was definitely a point where I considered her to probably be like number 5 or 6 on the list. Like, she was definitely higher at a point. I did knock her down a little bit, largely due to the fact that while she does do very effective work with certain jury members, I think, again, Natalie, she does very good work with. She does do very good work with Suri, especially in comparison to Amanda, where she really does prop up Suri's game. I also feel like she does ineffective work with someone like a James. Now, I don't think James was ever voting for her, but I do think first she tries to play off James's question as like kind of a joke, to which he's kind of irritated by, and then follows that up with a super strategic response, which is also not what James wanted to hear. So I do think her response to James isn't the greatest response in the world, and also ends up barely winning the game from this performance. I mean, she does technically wins Eliza's vote over the course of this Final Tribal, but doesn't effectively get Eric's vote along the way. Mind you, Eric ends up voting for Amanda kind of in a trolly way, but I do think Eric was someone that was definitely up for grabs that she could have potentially won over, but didn't. And for me, it is an overall pretty great performance here. Again, she butters up Suri and Natalie. She talks about how much she changed since the first time she played the game. She talks about all the big moves she played, talks about her leading the All Women's Alliance. Like, she does very good work in this Final Tribal, but it's those minor nitpicks for me that kind of leave her below this next tier of winners that we're going to be talking about, and leaves her here at number 10. Now at number 9, and as I said, from this point forward, I think these are all the top tier Final Tribal performances, and really numbers 9 through 5 all fit into a similar category of these all being winning performances that were already winning coming into Final Tribal performance and just didn't need to mess things up. And I do feel like the reason why they're not at the top of the list for me is largely because of this notion that they didn't have to do much to win the game with their performances. They were already winning. I do think the juries, for the most part here, were a lot easier on these winners. And I feel like that is a lot of the reason why their performances were so strong, is because they were able to not be flustered by the harsh questions that the jury would normally be facing them. So really, the next 5 people we're going to be talking about all fit into that similar sort of tier. And we're going to be starting off here with number 9 with the person that I feel like performed the worst out of this bunch, even though her performance is obviously still really strong, and that is the performance of Kim Spradlin. Now, for me, I feel like there are a couple knocks for Kim Spradlin that keep her lower than the others. I feel like, one, she doesn't handle Leaf particularly well. I feel like when Leaf talks to her about being hurt, her response is that I was never really close to you, which I don't think is the greatest response in the world. And also, I feel like when Troyzan asks her the question, she doesn't really give him an answer that he is satisfied with. And Troyzan asks for the moment that she took away his chance of winning the game, and like she responds with the Jonas vote, which to be honest is probably a more accurate vote than what Troyzan wanted to hear. But Troyzan very clearly wanted to hear about this situation where Kim supposedly orchestrated the split vote on the J vote on the way to tribal, which is technically against the rules, and Troyzan wanted her to admit to that, which she doesn't end up doing. But again, overall, Kim is very effective over the course of this final tribal. I think she articulates a lot of her decisions very well, particularly her decision to not take Christina to the end, to which she gets some flack for, which she articulates that Christina was a more palatable option for a potential bitter jury. Effectively explains the Michael vote in saying that he was the only one that Troyzan was willing to send home. Like, I think she does effective work over the course of this final tribal, explaining her strategy while also just being Kim and being someone that is extremely likable and someone that the jury would want to vote for. So while I do think there are a couple missteps, I do think for the most part her performance is very strong here. She lands in number 9. At number 8, again, another performance where this person didn't really need to do much, but still performed pretty solidly at the end of the day, and that person is Earl. Now, the one thing I don't like about Earl is that he does preach on honesty and integrity. He talks about how he played the hard way by not sacrificing his integrity, and like, again, not great, but I think does a good job at undercutting Cassandra and Dreams, talking about how he wants to get the respect vote, not the sympathy vote or the underdog vote. Mentions being the only Ravu member to make it to the end, and talks about how many times he went to Exile Island. He throws Dreams under the bus to Edgardo about the idol. I think he placates Yao in a pretty good way. We're talking about how Yao would have beat him at the end, which technically isn't even true, but again, he believed that at the time, and he does effectively make that argument. Talks about how the jury shouldn't vote on need, which again is something that was pretty important to this final 3, considering you had Dreams, who was literally homeless, and talks about how he manipulated everyone. Like, really, for me, again, overall, very solid performance, but again, it's also a performance where, like, he was already winning the game to begin with, and didn't need to really be doing much. Plus, also doesn't really have any massively, like, big standout moments, so because he does land at number 8 here. At number 7, again, similar thing, we do have the winning performance from Rob Mariano from Redemption Island. Now, again, like I think Rob overall performs pretty well here. And again, solely based off of their performance at the final tribal, not basing it off of how other people reacted to them, because I do think if we take that into effect, there were a lot of people that were kind of bitter towards Rob, that did say some negative things towards Rob. But I do think Rob does pretty well at responding to those things. He never acts bitterly over the course of this tribal. He never responds negatively whenever people say negative things about him. He does respond in a very gracious way. I did love his opening statement where he thanks Ometepe for giving him the opportunity to play with them, but also props up Zapatera by saying that he thinks it would have been a different story if he was on that tribe, which again gives a lot of those Zapatera players a lot of credit there. He ends up articulating his alliance making and his making of sub-alliances, and ends his opening statement with saying that it doesn't matter all the things that he's done. It really just matters what the jury thinks. Again, showing us an understanding of the game here that he definitely didn't have in previous seasons. He obviously talks about playing for his family, which again, obviously a good thing to say. He does prop up Grant, saying that he valued his relationship and talked about how Grant was going to beat him at the end. I do think he does a pretty good job at pacifying this jury in a position where he was already going to win the game. I think he clearly learned from his mistakes from All-Stars, and you can very just clearly tell that he understands the game in a much better way here. Again, there's nothing really that wrong with his performance here, so for me, he lands at number 7. Now number 6, which to me is like the biggest example that comes to mind when I think of someone that performed very well, but largely because the jury was already so much on their side. And that is the winning performance from Tony Velachos from Survivor Winners at War. And again, it's so weird to see the contrast here from his performance in Cagayan to his performance at Winners at War. And I think a lot of that comes from where the jury was. Again, like in the scenario of Survivor Cagayan, where a lot of the jury was very angry at him and was very bitter towards him, he ends up responding in a way that is very defensive, in a way that really just comes off as someone that, again, just isn't owning his game. Well, here at Winners at War, the jury was already so much on his side, to the point they were pretty much just laughing at like everything he was saying. They just absolutely adored him while he was out there, and I think you can clearly tell that that was the case. And I think that did better his jury performance as a whole. Now, I do think overall he does learn quite a bit from Cagayan by the time he gets to Winners at War. So I do think overall his jury performance was always going to be better here than it was in Cagayan. I think a lot of the jury's just overall positive thoughts towards him already does play into him having a better performance here. Especially because, like, I think one of the funnier things to realize here when rewatching this is that he very rarely actually answers any of the questions that the jury is asking him. Like, when asked of, like, oh, how'd you do it? How'd you manipulate some of these players? It's like, he just starts going and rambles off about the spy nest and, like, doesn't really answer the question, but he kind of gets away with it, again, because the jury already loves him. And, like, at the end of the day, it's like his performance is pretty flawless here, in the sense that, again, everyone loved his performance. No one was that upset with Tony here. I mean, obviously, like, Nick kind of acts upset at the beginning, but then he does easily pacify Nick. Same with Jeremy, but it's very clear that Jeremy's kind of doing it in a more joking sort of way. I do think Tony pretty expertly navigates around the questions about the edge, where he doesn't demean the people that were on the edge like Gavin did in Survivor Edge of Extinction, but still talks about how much the edge was a disadvantage to him and how much he was able to overcome that. Like, again, overall for me, like, Tony just has a pretty masterful Final Tribal performance here. And the reason why it's not higher, though, is because, like, I think at the end of the day, it's largely due to the fact that the jury wasn't very confrontational with him the entire way through. But he still lands here at number 6. And now number 5. And at number 5 here, we kind of have the top of these style of Final Tribal performances. There's technically one more later on, but I do feel like there's a minor difference in that one. But at number 5 here, again, one where the jury was so clearly on this person's side, and I do think that person took advantage of the jury being on his side to give a better jury performance, and that person is John Cochran. Now, for me, there was a debate on putting Cochran at like number 2 or 3. Like, I think there is a serious debate for that. I think Cochran's performance here is pretty masterful in the way that he's able to navigate around a lot of these questions, the way he's able to placate Malcolm, and talking about how, like, the reason why he's better than Malcolm is because of his heightened level of insecurity, and kind of like propping up Malcolm as being better than him at pretty much anything but Survivor. And I do like that response from him. Again, he obviously talks about being at the bar of the 3 amigos and having like 2 women on his sides, and again, like, really just shows his pretty strong social game over the course of this season. He talks about his evolution in his social game from his first time, and really just showing a lot of how he's improved since the first time he played the game. Talks about this being the culmination of his passion for Survivor, which I think is pretty good. He does also undercut Don multiple times through Final Tribal, talking about how he had to be Don's therapist, and that talks about how he used Don to get through the game. Talks about how adaptability and timing were the most important elements of his game, which I think are 2 very good responses there. I do think overall, again, Cochran plays this Final Tribal pretty perfectly. I have no real flaws with anything he says at Final Tribal here. The only reason he's not higher is because, again, like, he comes into this Final Tribal already winning an unanimous vote. Like, he had no real adversity here. And while he does undercut Don at points, I don't think he does it as effectively as maybe someone else will be talking about later on this list in undercutting their opponent. So because I kind of decided to leave Cochran a little bit behind here, leaving him here at number 5. And now number 4, and as I said, I think this top 4 are pretty brilliantly performed at Final Tribal here. I think 3 of the 4 here won largely due to their Final Tribal performances, where I do feel like there's definitely a chance that they lose the game if it had not been for how good their performances were. While the other one is, again, kind of part of that previous tier we just talked about, but I do think has a major difference that we'll talk about later. But we are starting it off with one of these people that could have potentially lost the game, but won due to their Final Tribal performance, and that person is Sophie Clark. I will say that I do think the one thing that is pushing me back to having her a bit lower here on the list is the fact that I do think her performance does come down to coach bombing his performance as well. I do think there's definitely a chance that she loses the game even with this performance if coach had also been able to perform pretty well. But Sophie does perform pretty brilliantly at this final tribal. I do think Sophie is really able to articulate her game pretty well here and really just take credit for pretty much everything that coach does. I mean, she compares coach to her young girl that she was able to drag through the game. She talks about how coach really found the idol, which makes him look pretty negatively in the eyes of someone like a Brandon. She talks about being coach's strategist, but along the way, I do feel like she also does good work in making herself look pretty positively to the jury in the sense that she gets emotional when talking about how she's cold and blunt and talks about how it's not a good quality to have, essentially showing her growth over the course of the season. But even outside of that, again, she talks about her strategy within the game and does effectively tell the jury what she was doing, while coach just completely bombs pretty much everything. And I do think no matter how good her performance was here, I do think if coach had given a good performance, he would have won the game. He just simply doesn't. I do think that is a minor knock for me from Sophie's performance here. I do think another thing that's kind of holding me back from putting her higher on the list, though, is I do feel like she also has kind of a rocky start to Final Tribal. I do feel like she does do pretty well once like the question starts getting asked, but I do think her like opening statement was one where she does sound very nervous during it, and I do feel like it's very clear that she doesn't feel super confident at that point in the tribal. I do think she gets better as it goes along, but overall, though, again, very strong Final Tribal performance, one that's effectively able to undercut her opposition and ends up winning her the game, so she lands here at number 4. Now number 3, and this is one that there's definitely an argument for this being the best performance in the history of the show. I know this is one that is very commonly brought up as one of the best performances. And obviously, it is one of the best performances. That's why he's at number 3 here. But I do feel like at the end of the day, it doesn't work on everybody. And that is why he is lower on the list here. So at number 3, we do have Chris Doherty. Now, Chris's performance is very strong, obviously. He's able to completely BS his way through so many questions here. Effectively gets Eliza's vote, effectively gets Julie's vote, effectively gets Sarge's vote. Talks about being loyal and overcoming the odds against 6 women. Talks about how devastated he was for what he did to Julie and apologizes to her in a pretty effective way. He does still talk about the strategy of his game and him taking advantage of when Twyla approached him and like doing a lot of these things that makes him look like the worse person, but also makes him look like the better game player. It's actually a really interesting Final Tribal performance in that way, in the sense that he is essentially spending a lot of this Final Tribal performance undermining himself as a human being, in effect propping up the jury as better human beings than him, but also not in a way that makes him look like a worse person to vote for. And also along the way does like kind of backhanded compliments to Twyla. Again, like he talks about how he took advantage of when Twyla approached him. That is in a sense saying that, hey, you should blame Twyla for the move that was made here. I do also love his response to Amy, even though he doesn't get Amy's vote, where he talks about how he's not better than her. It's just that she gave him a break while he didn't give her a break. I did also like the fact that, well, one, it's very transparent, but he does go through each of the jury members and talks about their great qualities, which I do really like, and I do think it was really effective with this jury. I do think in most juries it's probably too transparent to actually work, but it does come off as very effective here. I think he masterfully handles Sarge here. He also brings Julie her hat, which again is so transparent, but again, it does work. Again, the only reason he's not higher on the list for me, again, like I just feel like a lot of it is so transparent from a modern landscape of Survivor. I feel like if Chris had done this on a modern season, I think he would be looked at as a joke. Like I think in many ways, this is very Angelina-like behavior here in how much he's pandering to the jury, but it is so effective on this season that I can't not give him the credit for that. Even though, again, like at the end of the day, it doesn't work with Scout. Amy doesn't vote for him. Like, it doesn't work with everybody, but it does work enough to where it is very effective in getting him the jury votes he needs to win the game. So because of that, he lands here at number 3. Now number 2, and at number 2 here is the person I was mentioning with Cochran, where, again, I think this person has a very similar performance to Cochran, but I think also expertly plays the jury and also undermines his opponent the entire way through, and that person is JT from Tocantins. Again, I think JT does such a brilliant job at Final Tribal here in almost every possible way. Like, again, this is the second best tribal performance in my opinion of all time, and I think it really shows like how impressive to me how much he was able to undercut Steven at every single opportunity, where like I don't think Steven actually performs that poorly. I mean, Steven is one that it's always brought up as like one of the worst final tribal performances ever. I don't think his performance is actually that bad if you pay attention to what he's saying. I think the problem is that JT is able to undercut him over and over and over again, pretty much every single opportunity, every single time Steven tries to make a point, JT is able to do something immediately afterwards that undercuts him. You have JT also just masterfully playing this like loyal puppy to Steven, where like when Steven mentions the fact that he might have been put in a position where he would have betrayed JT, like JT just looks so sad. And I think, while again, I don't know if this works on a modern jury, I don't think a modern jury really respects this style of gameplay, it very much works on the Tocantins jury, and they were just completely eating this up. Like, he constantly talks about in this final tribal that he feels like a fool for taking Steven to the end, again really making it seem like he is this gracious, honest person, when in reality, again, obviously, he's very manipulative the entire way through. Again, he talks about how like he doesn't think Steven outplayed, or outlast him. Talks about how Steven's growth narrative shouldn't help him win the game, considering JT just did everything better than him, essentially. Talks about how he wants credit for not floating under the radar, unlike Steven. Talks about how he deserves credit for bringing Steven into Coach's alliance. Like, really, for me, like, JT's performance here is pretty masterful with very little downsides. The only thing that keeps it at number 2 here is the fact that, again, he was winning anyway. He came into his final tribal with a 6-1 vote, did flip over Tyson through his final tribal, but I think when we have someone that also has an equally impressive performance and also flips over more votes, I feel like that person deserves to be at number 1 for me, so JT lands here at number 2. Now at number 1, the number 1 final juror performance from a winner. I mean, it's obviously Todd. I mean, come on. Pretty apparent here. I think Todd has to be number 1. I think Todd is the very clear answer for most people. And again, Todd just dominates this final tribal performance. Again, he came into final tribal where it was going to be between him and Amanda, where it does seem like the Zenhus were leaning towards Amanda, and Todd is just able to completely dominate this final tribal performance. Really is one of the first final tribal performances to not rely on honesty and loyalty, and really just admits to his lying and backstabbing and the fact that he hurts people that he cared about. He hopes that they could separate game from personal. He talks about he knew he had to be the most strategic out there, as he wasn't really the best at anything else. He obviously has his brilliant response to John Robert, where he calls him his biggest threat and calls him an extremely great strategic player in your daily life, which completely flips John Robert to voting for him, to where Jean Robert didn't want to vote for Todd coming into Final Tribal. Also props up JR later in the Tribal Council by talking about how JR was right about him being this massive threat in the game from day one. Talks about always having his numbers throughout the game and being able to get to the Final Four with his numbers. Admits to getting close to Frosty just to put him on the jury. Says that he deserves the money more than Courtney because she's as much of a liar as he is, but he's more willing to admit to it. Like, he really just overall just admits to so much of his game. Again, he very clearly takes ownership of his game, which is something that, again, I don't think many players are actively able to do that well, especially in the older seasons of Survivor. I think, again, now in the modern landscape, it's something that we see very often is, again, that is what people are voting for nowadays. That is what people are looking for. But in the older seasons of Survivor, for someone to own up their game this much and gain the respect of the jury for that, I think is very, very impressive. Again, comes in his Final Tribal in a position where he's not guaranteed to win. It could go between him and Amanda, and he effectively undercuts Amanda along the way. Props up his game to be this extremely strategic one where he's able to articulate his positioning in the game while also really just buttering up certain jury members. It really is a masterful performance, and it is one that is very clearly my number 1 of all time here. But there we go. I mean, that is my ranking of every winning Final Tribal performance in the history of Survivor US. Now, again, I will be doing a losing Final Tribal performance list later on, which will be probably longer, and obviously that's going to be fun. But stay tuned for that. But for now, that's the video. Thank you for watching.